This is an RNZ podcast.
It's not exactly breaking news that publishing newspapers is a pretty tough gig in the internet era. Years ago, Trade Me swallowed up the classified adverts that were once called the rivers of gold, which made them so profitable. In 2006, our biggest newspaper publisher decided to buy what it couldn't beat, paying $750 million for Trade Me. And Fairfax Media, which is now called Stuff, sold Trade Me for much more than that 5 years later, but mostly to pay off its huge debts. Well, 10 years after that, the current owner, Sinead Boucher, was able to buy the entire company from its Australian owner for just $1 New Zealand dollar. So from rivers of gold to just one gold coin in only 15 years. Now, the closure of local and regional papers under similar pressures had already created so-called news deserts across the United States, places where local affairs were underreported or even unreported altogether. And the trend was documented by former newspaper editor turned journalism professor Dr. Kenton Bird from Moscow, Idaho, in the west of the United States. And in 2010, Dr. Bird came here to check out how our papers were doing. And at the time, he told RNZ's Jim Mora this.
So I'm just looking at my map of the North Island. I've seen dailies from the New Plymouth, the Taranaki Daily News. I've seen the Dominion Post, Hawke's Bay Today, the Gisborne Herald, and Bay of Plenty Times as well.
Okay.
My trip to the South Island begins next week, and so I expect I'll come back with a suitcase full of newspapers from the other half of the country then.
But Kenton Bird didn't just stuff papers into a suitcase, he blogged his whole trip around the country for 6 months, creating a fascinating snapshot of how our papers were back then, which is still online now. However, back in the US, things were getting worse, and former Baltimore Sun journalist David Simon, the creator of the TV series The Wire, memorably told a 2016 congressional hearing into the issue this.
The next 10 or 15 years in this country are going to be a halcyon era for state and local political corruption. It is going to be one of the great times to be a corrupt politician. I really envy them. I really do.
Now, later that year, Donald Trump got elected, swamping America's news deserts, lacking in trusted news sources, while research showed that his backing slumped in places with higher than average news subscriptions. Meanwhile, some newspapers that had survived Craigslist and eBay were getting picked off by vulture investors, and in 2018, the ailing Denver Post told its own asset-stripping owner, Alden, to sell the paper and get lost, a career-ending choice for the top editorial team there. And a former Denver Post editor, Jeffrey Roberts, told me this at that time.
It's not just politics. It's not just about Donald Trump. It's about your community. It's about all sorts of things that are important in your community, and that's what's missing when newspapers get decimated and other types of news organizations can't fill that void.
Well, same here in New Zealand, you could say. So when Kenton Bird from Moscow, Idaho arrived back in New Zealand recently, he was delighted to find that those daily papers he read and analysed here 12 years ago are still going. And when he popped into RNZ to catch up, I asked him if he thought they were as good now as they were back then.
When I arrived, I was impressed that the papers were, I believe I called them lively, interesting, and fun to read. Clever writing, strong headlines, strong local focus. And that still seems to be the case. The format has changed. Most of the regional papers I read were broadsheets at the time. Now they're tabloids, except on...
You made mention of that back in 2010. You said American papers had started to go tabloid size or something close to that size to save costs of paper, and you thought that was a mistake, and you were pleased that our local papers were broadsheets, but now there's no afternoon papers left anymore, and they're all, I think with one exception, the tabloid size presentation.
But the weekend papers, which presumably have more in-depth analysis, more space for the larger photographs, continue to be in that broadsheet format. So I appreciate that.
Well, one of the things that was top of mind for you back in 2010 was you were starting to see the emergence of what became known as news deserts in the States. So what is the situation now, all these years on?
I'm sorry to report that the downward trends have continued. A lot of the research done by Penny Abernathy, then at University of North Carolina and now at Northwestern University in Chicago, show that the number of titles is diminishing on the average of 2 per week, either through closures or consolidations. And the small towns and rural areas that perhaps most need a local news source are the ones that are losing their community newspapers, and that's cause for concern. And I wrote about this focused on the papers in the West, where there are both literal deserts and news deserts, and not much has happened that would change my pessimism as their budgets diminish. But the bright spots, which I called the blooms in the desert, are new digital independent startups on a nonprofit basis. They're not reliant on advertising or subscriptions. They have a new funding model that's primarily non-profit, some corporate grants, some donations, some memberships similar to what we have with public radio in the States. One in our capital city of Boise called the Idaho Capital Sun. Another one also in Boise specializing in education news. And one in nearby Spokane, Washington, covering religion, ethics, and values, called FAVES, or Faith and Values Spokane.
They sound really quite niche publications. So is it that a specific audience that's prepared to pay for that to be produced?
Well, through donations and through their subscriptions, but they're filling a gap in the information network, and I'm hoping that model will spread as the daily and especially those weekly community newspapers decline.
There was a situation that unfolded which made me think back to your visit all those years ago. This is the Denver Post. The newspaper was taken over by an organization, I think, called Alden, that invested in quite a few papers. But the Denver Post's own editorial staff came out against them in the newspaper, published editorials about the mismanagement. An official, some local official, joked to one of the paper's reporters at the time, if you close down, that's great. We can get away with a lot more. But that's the serious side to this, isn't it? That when these papers have closed, whether in places as big as Denver or even in smaller places, councils, local government doesn't get scrutinized and corruption can flourish.
Denver is one of the places where there are several of these digital startups that have emerged, particularly after that closure of the other daily in Denver was the Rocky Mountain News. The Post continues and I think is doing the best it can under the circumstances. But you're right that without that close attention to what local governments are doing, what local school boards, county commissions, it's very difficult for the public to stay abreast of what's going on.
Yeah, and actually you made a point of this in that article you mentioned that you wrote about these expanding news deserts, that even the fast-growing areas are not now able to support a kind of functioning newspaper or news organization.
And the challenge, of course, has been compounded by COVID. COVID has put the final nail in the coffin for other papers, largely through the loss of the small businesses that made up the advertising, and that only gradually has come back. But a labor shortage has made it difficult for the daily newspapers in my part of the country to find carriers for home delivery of the paper.
I believe today, Kenton, by pure coincidence, is World Newspaper Carrier Day.
Oh gosh, perfect coincidence.
I think carrier is not a term familiar in New Zealand, but we tend to call them paper boys or girls.
Paper boys, yeah.
Paper deliverers. And I only know that because I looked up Gannett, the newspaper group, because I'd heard some disastrous revenue figures and were about to lay off another tranche of journalists. In fact, yes, here's the statement from their media division head: in the coming days we will be making necessary and painful reductions to staffing, etc. And so Gannett, one of the biggest newspaper, if not the biggest newspaper publisher in the US?
Measured by number of readers, it is. I think there is another newspaper group that may have more titles, but Gannett has been challenged because the papers it owns are in places where population is moving to the suburbs, where the economies may not be as strong. Gannett had a lot of papers in Midwest, Great Lakes area, and where the population growth has now shifted to the so-called Sun Belt. And one of the stronger Gannett papers is in Phoenix, Arizona, where it is in taking advantage of the population growth, and it is doing fairly strongly and covering important news. But that's probably the exception to what's happening elsewhere in that chain.
And so have you had, as seemed to be going on a few years back, so-called vulture funds trying to pick up these distressed assets and maybe getting what they can out of them, looking for the land and buildings and things like that?
Well, the venture capital firms that have taken advantage of the weaknesses in the newspaper industry have swooped in as vultures and have liquidated a lot of assets, have cut the papers back to the bone, and that's been one of the sad developments. Formerly great cities with great newspapers are now struggling, and in some cases, there have been local entrepreneurs that have tried to buy the paper away from the vulture capitalists, but without success. I'm thinking particularly of Baltimore Sun, one of those papers that was great for most of the 20th century and fallen on hard times since then.
So when you were here in 2010, I mean, you remarked to Jim Mora back then on RNZ National that you thought that the online transition of our papers here might be around about 5 years behind the US. We still didn't have at that point premium content or digital subscriptions, basically getting money. It was all being given away for free on the internet, except for a couple of business publications. And you did mention at that time, even so the Wall Street Journal was doing it in the US, but even the New York Times wasn't really sure what to do, and only sort of some specialized content, sort of business operations and so on, were making it work in the States. Back then, people were even talking about micro payments, a few cents per story, which as we know hasn't really worked out as a strategy since then. But now, I don't know if you've had the chance to see it, but that is in play now here in New Zealand, both with the paid online subscriptions by the likes of the New Zealand Herald, or even donations and donation platforms for people to contribute.
One thing that I noticed in 2010 was that the internet service, Wi-Fi, fiber optic, was slow, expensive, and unreliable, especially in the rural areas of the country. And I think that's one thing that has been remedied since I was here before, that I remember how difficult then it was to get streaming video. And 12 years later, I think the broadband service seems to be more consistent. There were several providers that I could choose from in Hamilton when I signed up.
Yeah, it's a fascinating change, isn't it? Because you mentioned back then, I'm sure you don't remember, but when I listened back to your interview, it was right there saying that you could do all sorts of things. It was possible by 2010 to have galleries of photographs and attached video and so on, but you wouldn't be wanting to do that when it was gumming up your download time to put on all this,
right.
Take advantage of the multimedia options that existed.
So now the infrastructure is in place, and I think that's cleared the way for New Zealand newspapers to be digital first and not simply recycle their print content into their websites. And I am a subscriber to the New Zealand Herald's premium content because I know there are things beyond the paywall that I want to know about and haven't been able to get there without the paywall, without going around it to the premium content. And I think the same is true in the States, that maybe 2012 to 2015, news companies wised up and realized that they couldn't give away content. And so now you'll get maybe 1 or 2 stories free, some cases up to 4 per month. But then you've got to, if not subscribed to the paid online content, at least register so that company has your name and email address and is able to put you into their database for marketing purposes. So I think in both countries, that ability to reach customers digitally and more quickly has been advanced, and ideally that it's providing a revenue stream that those news organizations didn't have before.
And are you surprised then, Kenton, to be back all these years later, and those newspapers that you looked at so closely back then, Taranaki Daily News, Hawke's Bay Today and so on, they are all still in print? Some of the little community free sheets that you might have seen back then have been axed in the years since, but there have been so many reorganisations of the whole media business, not to only the online thing is only one of those things. But are you surprised now, all these years later, they're all still there?
If you had asked me as I was leaving in 2010, do you think these papers will still be here in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, I would have predicted some attrition, that the smaller, more remote regional dailies and maybe some of the weeklies in smaller places would have consolidated or closed. And so it suggests to me that there's perhaps a resiliency in the New Zealand character that continues to support and appreciate the values that these community papers provide. I think there's also the presence of a strong local retail market, that it hasn't been all subsumed into malls and big box stores. The arrival of Costco in Auckland notwithstanding, but my wife and I continue to be amazed as we travel around the Waikato region and places like Cambridge and Morrinsville and Gordonton all have a strong main street with small retailers that are the bread and butter of those community newspapers. And
sure, for them advertising on Facebook and so on, and the cost per thousand doesn't really come into it. It's much better to be in the paper, I think.
Yeah, but there seems to be this very strong retail sector that I think is a factor in the success, and that is no longer true in the U.S. There are small retailers, but they're less likely to advertise in their community newspaper. I was looking back at your blog from the time when you were here previously. You've posted some fascinating snapshots, they're fascinating to look back on now. For example, you went to Matamata, which at the time was high on being Hobbiton because of those Lord of the Rings movies, and local paper, the Matamata Chronicle, a weekly taken over by its editor Joel Maxwell, who you said was not afraid to go on Facebook to try and pump the stories out to a wider readership, even producing a local print product that probably relied upon the sorts of retail advertisers that you just mentioned there. Fascinating. Joel now is a senior journalist, a journalist working for Stuff. He's got expertise in Te Ao Māori, which is something that our media has been lacking, trying to address now. So, yeah, fascinating to see. Back then, he was taking over a paper of his own, trying to give it a go, and now he's part of the big chain. It's fun for me to look at some of the Facebook pages that I signed up for and followed 12 years ago that still will pop up into my feed. And the Matamata Chronicle is one of them. There's an Otago community page out of Dunedin, and one that for some reason I'm seeing for the first time in several months is Save Radio New Zealand Facebook page, which is something that was in the news a dozen years ago and maybe back in the news now as a result of the discussions over a new broadcasting authority here.
That's exactly right. That group was submitting to Parliament, and yes, it did make me think that it was around about that time with the under another government that wasn't so inclined to invest in public media that group had formed. Yes, so and Facebook, I guess the internet gives these things a long life. But back in 2010, there wasn't a lot of pressure on our media, and especially our newspapers, fairly traditional. Not a lot of pressure to represent the Māori world. And they weren't especially inclusive. We still know that there are very few Māori journalists throughout the industry. There's currently a cadetship and mentoring program to try and increase this. But also, most media companies now have Māori editorial strategies and Māori content strategies, which they never had before, Rautaki Māori. Have you, even in the short time you've been here, noticed a difference in the presence of Māori language and Māori issues in our media compared with 12 years ago?
That was one of the first things I observed on arrival was the degree to which the Te Reo Māori was appearing in print and on the air. The place names, the vocabulary, the presence of Maori political leaders was maybe a little more visible, and the bylines, the journalists, so it was eye-opening for me coming from a place. We have a strong Native American presence in my part of Idaho, but there's next to no visibility in print or broadcast media. And so it's refreshing to see that part of this country's tradition and heritage represented in the media. And I was fortunate to be here during the Maori Language Week in September, and so a lot more emphasis on the Maori language then, but it's something that I've continued to watch and appreciate, and so it's especially enlightening on the national news. I always watch the weather on TVNZ1, and to hear all of the place names. And to learn that there were names that were here for hundreds of years before the European settlers arrived in the 19th century that are now getting renewed visibility. So that's refreshing.
Well, it's good that you've picked up on that. And just very briefly, finally, before we let you go, you're here again on a sabbatical, so you'll be spending some months based in Hamilton, I think?
That's correct. Yep. A little shorter sabbatical, just late August through December. A chance to revisit places that I had been on the previous trip in 2010, but coming with a new set of eyes, new questions to ask, and greater appreciation for New Zealand politics, culture, and cuisine. New Zealand found a special place in my wife and my heart when we were here in 2010, and we're just thrilled to be back to be able to appreciate it again.
And in 30 seconds or less, what is the focus now of your research? What are you turning your attention to?
I'm looking at how journalists approach coverage of fringe groups, extremist movements, political leaders outside the mainstream, and how we as journalists can cover them fully and fairly without giving an excessive attention that would perhaps give them more visibility than they deserve.
And well, in the COVID era, that has emerged as an issue here. You've probably been dealing with it for a longer time, since the Trump election and so on, and all of those factors in the US. But have you formed any view on what you've seen in New Zealand's treatment of that, albeit from a distance, before you actually arrive back here again?
It's been a challenge for journalists. I think in New Zealand, it seems to have found a balance that there seems to be enough for the public to know to make informed decisions in elections, but perhaps without the sensational coverage that some places in the United States might give to those same people or the people of the same beliefs.